is log arc date 2015-1-4. Okay, I'm going to continue with chapter 20 of a section out of Eric Flint's book 1632, Ring of Fire, and reading it for a good reason. One of them is in the midst of war and battle. New relationships are struck up, and that's happened here. And of course the whole story focuses on one of those relationships, the relationship between Jeff, the dirt biking Dungeon and Dragons gamer, and Gretchen, a German girl from 1632. Alright, so Jeff and Gretchen has taken Jeff, and they have gone to look for Mein Bruder and other people. The first one she found was Diego. Gretchen had known the Spaniard was incredibly tough, but even she was impressed. Despite his terrible wounds, Diego had managed to crawl 40 yards from the front line where he was struck down. He was even still conscious. "Give me water," he whispered when she knelt by his side. He was lying on his back, his arms holding in his intestines. Diego's eyes opened. They were not much more than narrow slits. "And get me my woman. Where is that stupid bitch?" Gretchen raised her head and studied the scene around her. The battlefield was littered with bodies, especially where the Tercio's front line had been. Half of them, it seemed, were still alive. Men were moaning, groaning, a few were screaming. Men, and now a few women, were moving through the field, inspecting the bodies. The men were all garbed in that peculiar mottled clothing which the boy near her was wearing. The women wore white. Gretchen watched them long enough to make sure she understood their purpose. They were not killing the survivors, she saw. They were apparently trying to save the ones who might still survive. Even now she could see several small teams of people carrying wounded men away on litters. That might be good news if Hans... She pushed aside for a moment her fears and concerns for her brother. There was Diego to deal with for the moment, and for that the people around her might pose a problem. Diego spoke again in a hoarse whisper. "Water, you bitch. Are you deaf?" Gretchen examined the Spaniard's wounds. She did not think that even Diego could survive them, but she was not certain. Again she studied the people around her. None of them were very close, except... She turned her head and looked up at the boy she had asked to accompany her to the field. Almost like a cherub he seemed for all his size. The boy was tall, his body was on the heavy side, lots of fat there, and his round face was very earnest, an innocent face with its plump cheeks and blunt nose. Almost a silly-looking face with those peculiar spectacles. Gretchen had seen spectacles before, but only on rich old men, never on a young man, and certainly never on a battlefield. The boy's eyes, magnified through those lenses, were very bright green, healthy eyes. They were the one thing about the boy which did not seem childish in the least. Gretchen remembered the light which had flamed in those eyes earlier, and the anger with which he had marched to confront the mercenaries. A courageous boy, then. Perhaps now, also, and if not, perhaps he was simply an innocent. Stupid in the way such people are. She could remember barely being that stupid herself 2 years ago, a lifetime ago. "Pliss," she said, mustering what little English she had picked up from some of the mercenaries. "Look." She hesitated, trying to think of the word, then remembered. "Away." He stared at her. "Look away," she repeated, pleading. "Pliss, pliss," she sighed. He obviously did not understand. His plump face was simply confused. Innocent, unknowing. Gretchen studied his eyes and decided she had no choice but to trust them. "Water," hissed Diego, "and get me my bitch." Gretchen nodded to the wounded Spaniard next to whom she was kneeling. "He hurt," she groped, trying to think of the future tense. "Yes. He will hurt mein Schwester." The boy frowned. Clearly the words meant nothing to him. Again Gretchen groped for the English term. Not finding it, she tried circumlocution. Mein female Bruder." His eyes widened. "Your sister?" That was the word. Gretchen nodded. She drew the knife from her bodice. "Pliss, look away." The eyes widened still further. Very green they were. She realized they would be, even without the spectacles. The boy's heavy-lipped mouth opened as if to speak a protest or a command, but after a moment the lips closed. The boy stared at her. "Water, you bitch," said Diego. He added some words in Spanish, but Gretchen did not understand any of them except puta. Apparently the boy did. His face flushed with anger, or perhaps it was simply that he was not so innocent after all. Suddenly he came down on one knee, looming over them. He leaned forward. In an instant, Gretchen realized that he was shielding her from the eyes of the other people on the field. He said something in English, but she didn't understand the words. There was no need. His eyes were enough. Gretchen had slaughtered animals since she was 5 years old. Diego took no more time than a chicken. The little knife slit the carotid artery as neatly as a razor. Blood started pumping onto the ground on the opposite side from where she was kneeling. Not a drop spilled on her. She was an experienced animal slaughterer. Diego was very tough, so to be sure, Gretchen also drove the knife all the way into his ear. Then for 3 or 4 seconds she twisted the 3-inch blade back and forth in his brains. Diego was not that tough. Not even the Satan who sired him was that tough. When she was finished, she took the time to clean the blade on the Spaniard's sleeve before slipping it back into her bodice. Killing Diego had pleased her immensely, yet oddly she was even more pleased with the boy. He had said nothing throughout, but his eyes had never looked away, not once. Healthy eyes, very green, very bright. Gretchen decided the spectacles were actually rather charming. She rose. One necessity accomplished, another remained, perhaps 2. Only one, as it happened. Ludwig was already dead. Even his huge torso had been torn into shreds by the powerful guns of the strange men in their mottled clothing. Gretchen stared down at him. She had been half hoping Ludwig would still be alive so that she could have the pleasure of killing the man who had murdered her father and subjected her to 2 years of brutal rape. For a moment she was consumed by pure hatred. Then she spotted the little arm, a third arm, protruding from underneath the great gross body of Ludwig, and hatred was driven away by hope. Maybe, for the first and last time in his life, Ludwig had been good for something. The boy helped her lever Ludwig's body aside. Beneath, like a kitten under a lion, lay her brother Hans, and he was still alive, barely alive, but alive. As she rolled Ludwig off, Gretchen had seen the great wounds in his back. The stranger's guns, whatever that weapon had been with its horrifying dragon's stutter, had been powerful enough to shoot right through Ludwig and his armor, and strike her brother standing behind. But apparently the bullets had been deflected enough and lost enough of their force that her brother's wounds were not instantly fatal. Gretchen knelt by Hans and cut the straps holding his cheap cuirass, and then, gently as she could, she probed his wounds with her fingers. The momentary surge of hope faded as quickly as it had come. At least one of the bullets had penetrated his chest wall. Even if it could be removed, she would try her best with her little knife. The wound would almost certainly become infected with disease. She knew that disease. Men rarely survived it, even men much stronger than her spindly little brother. Her eyes filled with tears, remembering Hans and his spindly little life, remembering how hard he had always tried, cast into a world for which he was not suited in the least. He had been a studious boy, in love with books, and eager to follow his father into the printer's trade. He had often joked with Gretchen, telling her that if there were any rhyme or reason in the world, she would have been the one in the family carrying a pike. Big, strong, tough Gretchen. Through the tears and the sorrow and the hopelessness, Gretchen heard the strange boy's voice shouting something. He was not shouting at her, but at someone farther away. Her English was really very poor. The only word she could understand was the last one, repeated over and over and again. Now, 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 now. Moments later she heard the sound of clumping feet rushing toward them. She raised her head and wiped away the tears. 2 men were coming, followed very closely by a woman in white. Then her eyes spotted what the men were carrying, and all other thoughts were driven aside. A stretcher, a thing used only in her experience on many battlefields to carry away the men who might be saved. Startled, she looked up at the boy standing beside her. He was staring down at her. His face did not seem so young anymore. Or perhaps it was simply his eyes, green, clear, healthy eyes. There was promise in those eyes. All right. Well, that's the end of chapter 20. Got 2 of them done. Coming back from a cattle drive, so that'll be it for today. This is Jerry Diamond. If you're listening to this, you are the remnant. Be safe and be blessed.